Have you ever walked through a forest and just felt like there's more going on than what you can see? Like right under your feet, there's this secret, ancient network connecting everything. It's this idea that has totally captured our imaginations, a wood wide web, where trees are talking, sharing, and even looking out for each other. This concept has popped up everywhere, from huge movies like Avatar to best-selling books, and it's completely changed how a lot of us think about a forest. It's a really beautiful idea. But the big question is, how much of it is a great story and how much is solid science? All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with what the Wood Wide Web idea is all about. Then we'll dig into how these networks are supposed to work. After that, we'll look at a pretty big challenge to that whole story and break down 3 of the most popular claims. We'll explore how the public story kind of took on a life of its own, and we'll wrap up with what we know for sure. This is going to be a cool look into how science really works. So first up, let's get into this idea that has just grabbed a hold of us. It's a total shift in thinking, right? Moving away from seeing a forest as just a bunch of individual trees fighting for sunlight to seeing it as this interconnected, cooperative society. And this quote from ecologist Suzanne Simard, it just hits the nail on the head. Her work, which started way back in the 90s, really flipped the old script. For like 100 years, the main idea was that forests were all about competition, dog eat dog, or, tree eat tree. But Simard's research suggested that was only half the story, and that underground, something a lot more collaborative was going on. And from there, the idea just exploded. Thanks to bestsellers like The Hidden Life of Trees and documentaries, everyone started talking about it. The concept is actually pretty straightforward, but also kind of mind-blowing. Trees are all physically connected by this massive underground web of fungi. And through this, like a biological internet, they can pass around essentials like carbon, water, and nutrients. They might even send out warning signals about things like pests. It's basically an underground social network. So how is this all supposed to work? What's the machinery behind it all that makes such a complex system possible? Let's get into the mechanics. Okay, so the key here is something called mycorrhizal networks. It's a classic win-win situation, a symbiotic relationship. See, the fungi can't make their own food through photosynthesis, so they hook into tree roots to get sugars that the trees make. But in return, these superfine fungal threads, called mycelium, act like a massive extension cord for the tree's own roots. They're way, way finer than any tree root, so they can get into tiny spaces in the soil and are much better at soaking up water and key nutrients. And when this web connects a whole bunch of trees, bam, you've got a common mycorrhizal network, or CMN. Now this is where it gets really cool because this makes that invisible world visible. On the left, that's the fungus itself, Rhizopogon, a major player in Suzanne Simard's work. And on the right, this is wild. By using DNA fingerprinting, researchers could actually map out the connections. Each one of those dots is a Douglas fir tree, and the lines are the fungal links between them. So it's not just a theory. You can actually see the web right there. Looking at a map like that led Simard to a really powerful analogy. The structure, with its hubs and links, it looks a lot like the neural networks in our brains. It's what's called a scale-free network, which means you have a few super-connected hubs and then tons of other nodes with fewer connections. It's the same basic structure as the internet or airline routes. It's a super efficient and tough design for moving stuff around. And this brings us to the famous idea of mother trees. These are the big old trees in the forest, the main hubs we just saw on that map. Because they're so huge and have such massive root systems, they support the biggest and most diverse fungal networks. They're the superconnectors. And Simard's research suggested that these mother trees are key to nurturing the next generation, sending extra carbon through the network to little seedlings stuck in the shade down below. It's an amazing story, right? It's inspiring, almost magical. But, and this is a big but, in science, even the most beautiful ideas have to be put to the test, again and again. And recently, a group of scientists has kind of put the brakes on this whole narrative, asking a really tough question. Has the story gotten way ahead of the actual science? This quote from ecologist Justine Karst just nails the whole debate. She and her colleagues aren't saying fungi aren't important. They absolutely are. What they're arguing is that some of the most popular claims about what these networks do, especially all the stuff about intentional cooperation and communication, aren't really backed up by solid evidence from real forests, at least not yet. So, in early 2023, Karst's team published a paper in Nature, which is the same top-tier journal that published Samard's original work decades ago. And this is a perfect example of how science is supposed to work. It self-corrects. They went back and looked at all the existing studies and basically concluded that the evidence for a lot of these big claims is pretty thin. And in some cases, it's been misinterpreted or hyped up along the way. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. We're going to break this down by looking at the three biggest claims at the very center of this debate. We'll look at the popular idea and then see what the scientific critique has to say. First things first, the most basic claim. Are these huge forest-wide networks even a common thing? I mean, this is the foundation of the whole Wood Wide Web idea. So is it true? So on one hand, you've got the popular idea of this massive, stable network. But the critique on the right points out a pretty big issue. We've actually only mapped these things in detail in a handful of forests. That amazing map we saw earlier, it's from one of only 2 studies that have shown those kinds of extensive links. And there's another huge question. How long do these connections even last? These fungal networks can change really fast, so we don't know if a link that's there today will be there next year, which it would need to be to provide those long-term benefits. Okay, next up is probably the most heartwarming claim of them all, the idea that mother trees actively feed seedlings, sending them goodies through the network to help them survive in the shade. So does the evidence actually back that up? This is where it gets really nuanced. The critics aren't saying resources don't move around underground. They do. The question is the network the main reason, and more importantly, does it actually help the little guys? Karstein looked at 26 different studies, and the results were kind of all over the map. Being connected to the network was just as likely to be bad for a seedling, or do nothing at all, as it was to be good for it. I mean, think about it. Competition is still a huge deal underground. The overall benefit for seedlings just isn't a proven thing. And finally, the most dramatic claim. That trees can send out targeted alarm bells about things like bug attacks, and that they send these warnings specifically to their own kids. This suggests a level of intention that is just, wow. And this is where you see the biggest gap between the story and the science. According to the critique, there is not one single peer-reviewed study done in a real forest that supports this idea of trees warning their own kin. The experiments that do exist were usually done with tiny seedlings in pots in a greenhouse. And in those lab settings, there were other ways the signals could have traveled, like through the air, that they couldn't rule out. So for now, it's a really exciting idea, but one without proof from the wild. So this makes you wonder, right? If the evidence for some of these really big claims is weak or just not there, how did the story get so popular and widely accepted? It's a really interesting look at how science gets communicated and how sometimes a great story can just take off. This timeline really shows you the journey. It all starts in 1997 with Samard's big paper. Then for almost 20 years, the research chugs along mostly in academic circles. But around 2016, popular media gets a hold of it, and it goes viral. Books and documentaries translated the complicated science into a simple, powerful story. And it wasn't until 2023 that a formal scientific critique came out to try and reset the conversation. That's a lot of time for the popular story to grow. And check this out, it's not just about the public media. Karst's paper pointed out a problem that can happen inside science itself, kind of like an echo chamber. They found that the rate of unsupported citations, which is when one scientific paper cites another one but kind of exaggerates the findings, has pretty much doubled. It's like a game of telephone. One paper might say something is possible, the next paper cites it as being likely, and by the third, it's cited as being proven. Even scientists can get swept up in a good story. So after all this back and forth, you're probably wondering, okay, so what are we left with? What can we actually say for sure? It's super important to separate the things being debated from the foundational science that pretty much everyone agrees on. Okay, so here's the bottom line. Nobody, and I mean nobody, disputes how incredibly important these mycorrhizal fungi are. It is a stone-cold scientific fact that they are essential partners for most plants on Earth. They are the main way trees get nutrients from the soil. They physically protect roots from disease, and they are absolutely vital for building healthy soil and locking up huge amounts of carbon, which is a big deal for fighting climate change. The debate isn't about if they're important, it's about those specific claims of intentional cooperation. And getting the science right really matters because these popular ideas are starting to shape how we manage our forests. And all of this leaves us with one last big question. The story of the Wood Wide Web has inspired millions of people to see forests with a new sense of wonder. And that's a great thing. It's given us this amazing metaphor for how connected everything is. But it also shows this tension. How do we balance the power of a great story that makes us care about nature with the slow, careful, and often messy process of science? There's no easy answer, but it's a conversation that's absolutely worth having.